to the screen for a video message from Mayor Regina Romero of Tucson, Arizona.
Good morning. Buenos dias. I am so happy to be a part of this national, nonpartisan conversation on voting rights, even if only virtually. Thank you to our host, Mayor Turner, all of our co-hosts, and all of you here today that join us in this important dialogue. As we all know, the right to vote is the foundation of our democracy. I am the proud daughter of immigrant farm workers. Although my family has lived in the Sonoran Desert region for over 7 generations, I was the first person in my family to be born in the United States. Like many of us, I learned important lessons from my parents. I learned to respect our environment, to work hard, to value education, and to always exercise my right to vote. As a young girl, I never thought I'd be mayor of Tucson. When I first came to Tucson to attend the University of Arizona, I started organizing neighborhoods and my community. I also worked on the campaigns of candidates I believed in and on issues that mattered to me. I helped registered voters and teach people about civic engagement. I began to understand more and more deeply how important it is for people, especially people of color, young people, women, people from areas that suffer from historic disinvestment, to register to vote and exercise that right to vote, to elect people that care for their issues. My dad once said to me, "Regina, you will vote for our whole family." Until my siblings became citizens, that was true. With our votes, we are able to choose elected officials who will determine the path of our democracy for years to come. Right now, the right to vote is under attack in very different sorts of ways. We are seeing voter suppression laws, people being removed from lists of registered voters. We are seeing legislation that calls into question the legitimacy of our early voting system and significant and redundant identification requirements. We are seeing intimidation tactics, including armed demonstrators at voting sites. In the aftermath of the 2020 Arizona election, armed protesters assembled outside of a vote counting center. The work to protect the right of each and every qualified voter to vote is an absolute necessity, as is working to register each and every person who is qualified to vote. As mayors, we are uniquely situated to encourage people to register and use their right to vote and civic engagement. We can create and amplify a culture of voting. I am proud to join you in this fight to keep voting accessible and fair. Have a productive gathering y a trabajar.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Pastor Jesus Nathan Roca of Fortaleza Espiritual Ministries for this morning's invocation.
Good morning. Good morning to everybody. I'm glad to be here this morning. My wife Edna is with me, and I want to thank God for this privilege, and our mayor Sylvester Turner for this opportunity to pray for this occasion. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I come to you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, my Savior. Lord, our city is your city. Lord, protect us from evil and all dangers. Lord, you have placed our leaders in authority, giving wisdom and brightness. Lord, I pray for our mayor and his staff. Lord, I pray for our police officers. I pray for all our firefighters. I pray for our doctors, Lord. I pray for Houston, Lord, for our city. Lord, I pray for all the citizens. Lord, help us to work together to have a great city, and not only a great city, but a great nation. I ask you in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you.
Please turn your attention back to the screen for a beautiful short film entitled Otis's Dream.
Let me tell you a story. A story about my father, Otis Moss Sr. It's the story of my father's determination to exercise his right to vote. One morning in the fall of 1946, he got up, determined to cast his ballot. My father was a farmer, a sharecropper in the rural South. He served in the military during the First World War. Always a man of dignity, quiet courage and determination. Our mother, his devoted wife, had died at an early age, and my father struggled as a single parent of 5 children.
I'm going to vote today.
We were amazed, excited that our father is about to do something really significant.
Go vote, Buckner! Vote him out! Yeah, go get him! We love you! Go get him! Good luck! Bye! We love you! Take care! Go vote him out!
He walked from the house well-dressed, well-groomed, 6 miles to the town center. Now, in every age, things have been introduced to keep certain people from voting, especially black people. We knew the racism, the hatred, the injustice represented in Governor Eugene Talmadge.
And some of the Negroes will vote if I'm your governor. They won't vote in our white primary the next 4 years.
He was well aware of all of the dangers, toils, snares, and roadblocks to keep him from voting. But he was willing to face all of that and exercise his right to vote. He did not know what the experience would be for him on that day, but he was well aware of what was taking place all over the South at that very moment.
Mr. Goldsmith, my best to your family.
Sir, I am Otis Moss, and I am here to vote.
What did you say your name was?
Otis Moss.
Otis, it looks like you've come to the wrong polling place. You need to go over to the Mountville School.
I have a letter here from the county stating that I vote here.
People from your side of town are to vote in Mountville. You're supposed to get a letter, but the mail's been slow this past few weeks. Now, did he come in? Have you seen him?
I think he came here a little earlier.
May I have my letter back?
Please.
Let me tell you a story about my grandfather. He'd already walked 6 miles to the first polling place. Now he's being told, you've come to the wrong place. A clear and blatant lie. Now he has to go to the Montville School. The Montville School is in a different city. I imagine as my grandfather walked, the sounds of the world crept into his ear. You are a second-class citizen. You are 3/5 of a person. You are nothing but a Negro. But in his spirit, he heard his faith and the song say, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Not just walking, but marching to the next polling place. He steps through the doors of the Montville School, unsure of what he will face.
Bless you. Yes?
I'm here to vote. I was sent here from the LaGrange courthouse.
You are in the wrong place. You're supposed to vote at the Rosemont School.
Now, the clerk from the courthouse said I was to come here.
I don't know about that, but I know you're supposed to vote at the Rosemont School.
Ma'am.
Let me tell you the story of my great-grandfather. Because of the color of his skin, he was held back from voting. Voting, a basic right of his, one of his freedoms. And because of the way he looked, he wasn't allowed to. Despite the next polling place being 6 more miles, despite the disappointment and the anger and the frustration, his determination, strong will, and dream to vote outweighed any disappointment that crossed his mind.
Boy, I sure am sorry, but the polling place closed. Now, if you would have been here 5 minutes earlier, we would have let you in.
Wounded, but never give up. Denied, but never accepting that denial. Insulted, but refusing to accept the insult inwardly, and thereby setting an example and a memory for generations unborn. Just a few years after that, our father was killed in an automobile accident. Fast forward, I became a participant in the civil rights movement and the voting rights movement, and joined Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Selma March, witnessed the signing of the Voting Rights Bill 1965. That was a great moment. It was a great victory. in the civil rights struggle. It was a great accomplishment. However, no one could dig up our father's bones and put a ballot in his hand. Some things are beyond repair.
Give Papa a minute here. Next time. Next time. Listen here. Promise me. If you get a chance, you gotta vote.
One of the remarkable moments in my life and in my memory is taking my son, Otis III, to vote. I paused on my side of the curtain in prayerful silence and listened to Otis III punch his ballot. That became music. Freedom music. Liberation music. The sound of my father's footsteps trying to cast his vote.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ms. Greta Betakovich, Associate Director of Democracy at the Center for American Progress, a moderator for the Safe, Secure, and Reliable Elections for All panel. She's joined by our distinguished panelists, Mayor Greg Fisher of Louisville, Kentucky, Clifford Tate, Harris County Elections Administrator, and Ms. Maria Town, President and CEO of American Association for People with Disabilities. Thank you.
I will say it's going to be extremely difficult, I think, for our panel to follow that video. That was extremely touching.
Because that other school's looking at us.
But I'm hoping that we can give you all some very entertaining.
You are. So I think that's a big key. Tavera?
On off now? Oh, there we go. So thank you all, everybody, for joining us on this beautiful morning in Houston. I think we're the last session of the conference, so thank you all for being here today, and I hope we can provide you with a very entertaining and thoughtful discussion from our panelists. As it was said, my name is Greta Betakovich, and I'm the Associate Director of Democracy from the Center for American Progress, which is a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. that aims to advance liberal and progressive policies. And I'm joined here today by my fantastic panelists, Clifford Tatum, and then of course Maria Town, the President and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities. I just wanted to start by a little framing our conversation today and what we're here to talk to you about, which is obviously safe and accessible elections and what local leaders can do to ensure voter confidence and that people trust our election processes. Over the last few years, we've seen increased obstacles for people in casting their ballots in comparison to what we saw during the 2020 elections. We know that disinformation, again, is going to be rampant around the election process. And of course, we've seen attacks on voting by mail, language assistance, things like the elimination of curbside voting that obviously affect people with disabilities. All of these are going to be affecting elections this year, which are just about 50 days out from today. But even the early voting process in many states is just starting in just a few days. Minnesota, I think, is just in about 3 or 4 days now. So really the election process is just around the corner. So I'd love to start our discussion today essentially by talking a little bit about vote by mail and what local leaders can do to ensure that people trust the voting by mail process. We've seen a lot of states attacking the vote by mail process. We've seen tons and tons of disinformation trying to undermine a secure method for voting. So I'd love to hear from you both about what you think local leaders can do to underpin the vote by mail process and kind of bring public trust back to such an important voting method.
Testing, there we go. So thank you very much for inviting me to be on this wonderful panel. And as the Harris County Elections Administrator, one of the primary goals of our office and mission is to ensure accessibility to the polling place and to the ballot itself. And so when we talk about accessibility, we think not just as it relates to physical access, but actually education, ballot access, and language access. So when we talk with our city leaders and our advocacy groups about what they can do to support the elections process, it starts with education, explaining to the voters, to their constituents, what their rights are and what the methods are for actually casting a ballot. So the question about vote by mail and ensuring that a ballot is actually, that the application is actually completed properly and that the application is submitted back to our office. And then once the voter gets the ballot, they return the ballot with the same information. It's all about education. How do we get the information that the voter needs to know in order to complete their application properly and then to return their ballot properly so that we can then cast the ballot, count the ballot. As the election administrator, I can't impact the laws that are actually on the books, but what we propose to do is to provide our constituents with the information and the education to help them understand what the process is and how to engage in the process.
I got you. One of the things that local leaders can do in local elections and a policy that they can champion for county elections or state elections and in federal elections is automatic eligibility to vote by mail. Many states, like Colorado, for example, is all vote by mail. Their primary method of voting is by mail. But in a state like Texas, to vote by mail, you have to apply for the privilege. It's not automatic. And when we think about particularly the threats of violence that voters may face today, voting from home is a way to ensure individuals' safety. And so the easier that we can make it for people to choose which method works best for them, the safer people can be, and hopefully the more they will vote. So automatic vote by mail, having those ballots mailed to everyone, regardless of their disability status, is a very important policy that leaders can pursue. Another element that will make voting from home much easier is the removal of signature verification requirements. What signature verification requirements refer to is, when I go to the Department of Motor Vehicles and get my state ID, because I do not drive like many disabled people and seniors and many others, when I sign my ballot voting by mail, the signature that I use to sign my ballot has to match the one that is on my ID. For people with disabilities, like myself, who have cerebral palsy, who lack fine motor skills, their signature changes all the time. For folks who are blind or low vision, their signature may be on a different spot on the paper. And so one of the things that we have seen across the country in states, counties, and cities that have signature verification requirements is that weeks after the election, individuals are sent a letter saying, we couldn't verify your signature, we couldn't count your vote. So removing signature verification from mail-in ballots can expand enfranchisement, particularly for disabled people.
So much, Maria. I absolutely agree with everything that you've said, and I think states like Colorado have shown a great example in what accessible voting systems can look like. Clifford, I did want to go back to one point that you were talking about, voter education. We've seen a lot of restrictions on mail-in voting in Texas in particular, and we saw some ballot rejection rates increase with early elections this year that then decreased a little bit later as some more voter education efforts were undertaken. I think there's been huge voter education efforts across Texas. Can you talk a little bit more about the effect that you think those will have for the general election, and if there are any other vote-in-mail processes, or like there's anything in particular that you're still kind of worried about that you think needs more voter education?
So our communication and outreach team is out in the streets of Harris County on a daily basis, and they've determined through interaction with some of our constituents that about 1 in every 4 voters in Harris County is at some level functionally illiterate. So part of what that tells us that some of our activities needs to include are more visual aspects of training so that voters can see exactly what it is they're required to provide versus having them read what it is they're required to produce. And so then in a corollary to that, then parts of our audio message needs to include the information that should be provided on an application as well as on the ballot itself. So one of the things internally that we're seeing and doing as it relates to the applications that's coming in and the ballot envelopes that are coming in is we've changed the manner in which the ballot board is reviewing the signature and the identification number that actually is supposed to appear on the envelope that matches the application. What we know for certain is that when a voter actually gets the ballot sent out to them, we know that the number on their application matched the number in the voter registration system itself. So as that ballot comes back, now we're able to immediately see whether the number on the ballot matches the number on the application. And that adds just a more efficient process of processing that ballot. The state has passed a law that identifies a rebuttable presumption. So if the 2 numbers match, then there's a rebuttable presumption that the signature matches. So the board can take a quick look at the signatures to ensure that they do match. And if there's a discrepancy, then there's a second look at that signature. So there's not just a single person that's deciding not to process an application, not to process a ballot. So that's some of the safeguards that we put into place. But again, it comes back to education and how we're getting the information out to our constituents to understand what exactly it is that they need to provide to access the ballot.
That's fantastic. I think you made really compelling points about how visuals and audio can also aid in this process, and it's crucial to this process for a comprehensive voter education campaign. I would also love to talk about the physical access aspects of voting. A 2017 Government Accountability Office study found that almost 60% of polling places have at least some features that make them inaccessible. Outside of the polling place, you're right. So even like parking your car, accessing everything, a ramp, all those things, 60%, which is a huge, huge problem. But we also know things like voter election websites, registration websites, all those things also need to be accessible. With less than essentially 50 days until the general election, could you all talk about at least one aspect of the voting process that you think election officials can target to improve accessibility for in these last 50 days? And I think we're joined by Mayor Greg Fisher from Louisville, Kentucky.
Sorry. I thought this started at 10. Good to be here.
No worries. We love a late joiner, and I love that the last seat is now filled. We were just talking about accessibility of polling locations and what we think election officials can do basically within the last 50 days before Election Day. If there's kind of one thing that you could target and put on your wish list, what do you think they could do to improve accessibility?
For what?
Accessibility for polling places before Election Day.
You know, we're in a situation that's pretty good in Louisville, in Kentucky. We went from one of the most restrictive places to vote before the pandemic to one of the most flexible places during the pandemic, and then it went back to kind of a hybrid of the two. So accessibility has been an issue that was at the forefront of all that with some really basic things. For instance, when somebody comes to the vote, if there is an issue that they feel like is going to be difficult for them, there's a bell at the beginning, just a visual cue to say, hey, I need help. And then within the polling place, there's also, you can have assistance, there's color cues as well. But it's been a big emphasis of ours to make sure that everybody can be accessible to voting. I mean, we're at a point right now where our country is at a crossroads. I mentioned this during the press conference yesterday. And the need to be loud around these issues relative to access for everyone has never been more important. I said yesterday again, you know, democracy dies by 1,000 cuts. And we're just seeing this gradual taking away of the primary issue, voting rights. That's not a cut, that's a gaping wound. And so we're very intent in Louisville in particular. Louisville is kind of an outlier from the rest of the state of Kentucky, but I want to give some credit to our Secretary of State, where he, a Republican, and the governor, a Democrat, came together in a really bipartisan way to reform access to voting booths in Kentucky. So it's a good example of good things that can happen when people work together and kind of put party aside.
So from an election administrator's perspective, we, in choosing polling locations, start well before 50 days. So about 6 months out, we're actually going out conducting an accessibility survey of every location that will be used for an early vote center as well as for an election day vote center. And we measure and assess according to the DOJ requirements. So when we find a location that does not meet the DOJ requirements, we determine whether there's remediation efforts that we can put into place to provide physical access. And sometimes that involves adding a temporary ramp to it could be any impediment as it relates to the slope of the curb walking up to the doorstep to a 1-2 inch rise stepping through the threshold itself. So we offer temporary ramps to a number of locations that will provide that next level of accessibility. We have found that on some occasions we've had to stop using what's affectionately known as a traditional polling place to move it to another location that will provide just that accessibility. And what administrators know across the country is that if at some point we aren't providing accessibility, we typically get into conversations with the DOJ, and there's lawsuits involved, and there's settlement agreements, and we're actually under a settlement agreement right now with the DOJ for some of our polling places. So we are just that much more diligent on ensuring that all of our locations are accessible. So as we look at some of our more historical and traditional places, we will have to have tough conversations with some of our precinct judges, polling place judges, about whether or not that facility can remain a facility. And then that raises a whole nother question about accessibility, because now we're talking walkable, drivable, and for folks with disabilities, asking them to go another mile or 2 miles if they're walking, if they're on public transportation, becomes just one more issue of accessibility that we have to consider when we identify locations.
I'd like to build on this really quickly. So, as you all are hearing, accessibility is a really broad term, and we might think about it in terms of ramps and braille and sign language interpretation. But in truth, accessibility can also mean seeing other people like you in that space, trusting that space, knowing that you will be safe. And so to your point, one of the things that we've seen in Georgia, for example, is the Americans with Disabilities Act and violations of polling places being used to shut down polling places in historically black areas. This is using federal civil rights legislation to suppress votes. But when we take a step back, what we see is that the ADA is being used to shut down polling places in areas that have been historically disinvested in terms of infrastructure. And so when I see huge pieces of federal legislation, like the American Rescue Plan and like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, passing, one of the questions that I ask is how can we use the funding that's going to come out of those billion-dollar laws to ensure that spaces and places that are historic or traditional polling places have accessible sidewalks, have accessible parking, have adequate parking, and are modified so that the communities who like to vote there and who feel safe to vote there can continue to vote there. And that's what I want to see local leaders doing, right? Instead of saying, oh, we can't use this polling place anymore because it's not accessible, instead thinking, well, how is this polling place accessible and how do we make it more accessible? What resources do we need to get to this community to make sure that they still trust this process? And Mayor, to your point, one of the tactics that I think is a great strategy is citywide or countywide or parish-wide polling places. When I think about what happened to Mr. Moss, if he hadn't had a specific place that he was supposed to go vote, right, if he could have voted anywhere along the 20 miles that he walked, maybe he would have been able to vote that day. And for some folks, maybe the polling place that they're assigned to is a place that they can't rely on. But if they take the bus a few stops to another neighborhood, they know those poll workers, they speak the same language, and they feel safe casting their vote. Thank you.
I think that's exactly right, and I think we've seen some states like California innovate with vote center models that can make it much more accessible for some people. You know, maybe you're not voting 2 blocks from your neighborhood, but maybe it's a neighborhood that you're more comfortable with or that's closer to your place of work, and that provides a lot of other accessible options. I always remember one story from the 2020 election that I believe was here in Harris County, where a voter in a wheelchair had to take 3 public buses that took him, I think, about an hour and a half almost each way to drop off their mail-in ballot in a drop box because the mail was so slow, so they didn't want to mail their ballot back, and that was just during the 2020 election. And obviously, I think the story that we saw, you know, the struggles in that are very similar and clear signs of, you know, voter suppression. Maria, I'd just like your thoughts on this next question as well, and everybody is always free to chime in. But I think we've seen some struggles oftentimes between the security community in elections and the accessibility community in elections. And I know you're smiling because it's a constant struggle that I'm sure many local leaders are facing every day and in every election. But I think, you know, it kind of comes down to the crux of the fact that there is just no perfect technology that we've yet invented that finds the right balance, that is fully accessible and anonymous, and is also fully secure, which is always a moving target, obviously, and it's hard to say that something is fully secure. But I would love your thoughts on where you think that kind of like seesaw balance between accessibility and security is moving in the next few years.
So it's interesting that Greta's asked me this question because I know her organization and my organization have different positions on this issue. So one of the things we've seen, particularly since the 2016 election, is a move towards paper ballots. Because understandably, lots and lots of people are very concerned about elections being hacked. And when we think about security, and election security, that's one of the primary things that's on my mind. Well, as you've mentioned, a huge swath of people in the United States can't read what's on a paper ballot, and that may be due to language access issues, it might be due to disability. We have a category of folks called print disabled, and that refers to people who are blind, folks who are dyslexic, again, people who may struggle to hold something like a piece of paper and mark it. And unfortunately, for many folks who have this identity, It means that they cannot vote anonymously and they cannot vote independently. And when we talk about the right to vote, that's actually what we mean, the right to vote independently and anonymously. I should have the right to go into a polling place by myself and cast a secret ballot. But instead, disabled people, many people who are not fluent in English or literate, have to rely on assistance from someone else. And then they cannot affirm that their ballot was marked in the way that they wanted, right? So we've seen people on Twitter say, oh, you know, my grandparent wanted to vote for this candidate and asked me to help them with their ballot, but I marked it the way I wanted to vote. And people think it's funny, but it's not. And so the position that we've taken is that folks need to be able to vote electronically if that is the most accessible method for them, to be able to receive their ballot electronically, use assistive technology like screen readers to read it, fill out their ballot, and submit it electronically. And currently, 29 states have electronic ballot delivery. Only 5 states allow electronic ballot return. One city, Boston, Massachusetts, I don't know if there's anybody here from Boston, allows electronic ballot return. And there is a tension, as Greta mentioned, between the disability community and the election security community. But in our opinion, what we need to be doing is testing this technology, figuring out how to make it as secure as possible, instead of saying paper ballots are the only way to go, because that will result in voter suppression unintentionally. And currently, we have the UACAVA system, and UACAVA stands for Uniform
Forward Overseas Citizens and Voters.
And Voters Act. And so this is the system that our armed service members who are deployed overseas use to cast their vote. It is a fully electronic system. This is the system that is good enough for our men and women in uniform. Why can't it be good enough for people with disabilities?
Appreciate hearing your thoughts on that, and obviously it's a ever-evolving discussion, and I hope that we can continue to work together on issues like that. Mayor Kirkpatrick, I have a question for you, and just obviously for the panel in general, I want to focus a little bit more of our attention on threats to election officials. We've seen an increase of threats to election officials all across the country, regardless of party, since the 2020 elections, and I know some of those threats have especially been focused in Kentucky for part. I know Secretary of State Michael Adams has testified about some of the threats that his office has gotten. And I would love to hear from you all about what you think local leaders can do to support election officials in these threats they're receiving, and also how we can support voters who might also, be afraid of the threats that polling locations might be receiving, any voter intimidation efforts in front of polling locations, or anything like that.
Well, it's a wild time, in America in terms of threats that are going on. We're seeing governors trying to be kidnapped. We're seeing mayors being assaulted. We're seeing school boards being disrupted everywhere. So the main thing a mayor can do is, set a tone for civility and just continue to emphasize that. Fortunately, in Jefferson County, which is where Louisville is, there were 0 threats in this last election cycle. But we work at it in terms of having a presence of police at polling stations, moving throughout polling stations, monitors as well, quick access to any type of law enforcement that's needed, and just continuing to talk about civility. One of our city values is compassion. And we know there's disagreements, but they can be had agreeably in our society as well. So we are on constant alert. Our police department, it receives specific training in front of elections as well, so that they can be aware of potential flashpoints that could be taking place, because this is a time, obviously, of significant interest, and there's some issues that are not specifically on the ballot and are on the ballot that will lead to a lot of emotions. There's a constitutional amendment regarding abortion rights in Kentucky coming up on this November ballot. Of course, that a lot of deep-seated emotions all the way around for that. So the type of extremism that we're seeing in our country right now, there was an interesting summit at the White House last week, United We Stand, where the country used to put most of our resources, 90%, at foreign terrorism. Well, we're switching that right now to higher awareness and resources around domestic terrorism. So this is something that we cannot be naive to as America, and unfortunately it's part of America today, and where it could come to its pinnacle could be on voting days.
There's a number of conversations that's taking place at the state level, the local level, and the national level on security task force and how to identify these extreme threats, how to respond and be prepared to identify physical interaction that presents itself at a polling place or at the vote center or at the central count station, which is what we saw in the 2020 election after election day, on election night itself. And so we're having conversations about what security looks like at our central count location. And the mayor is right that there has to be a concerted effort by both parties to tone down the rhetoric. We have to return to civility. And what we like to say as election administrators is the election judges and the people that are working the polling locations and at central count, they're our neighbors. They're our friends. They're not strangers. They're not someone from some other area that's coming in proposing to do something nefarious to the elections process. We're simply providing access to the polling locations, and we're counting the ballots as they're being cast. We're not putting our finger on the scale. We're well past those allegations or assertions that somehow the machines are being hacked and somehow votes are being flipped and that somehow paper ballots are being destroyed. That's not what election administrators do. We have poll watcher systems now that allow folks to come into the polling place and to actually observe what's going on. The state of Texas has implemented a poll watchers training program that lays out the criteria and what the responsibilities are of a poll watcher, and there's only so much that a poll watcher can actually do at a polling location, and the key term there is watch. They don't get to interact with a voter. They interact with the election judge, with the polling place captain, and if they see something that they don't particularly understand, then the captain can explain what it is that they're seeing. And so we're being diligent. We're working with our county attorney and with the county administrator to identify the security measures that we can put in place with being certain not to demonstrate so much law enforcement or security at any particular polling place that people don't want to show up, that they're afraid to show up, or that they feel that they can't go there because there's going to be some level of intimidation. So it's a delicate balance, but I think the mayor is right. We have to address the tone, and hopefully that gets us back to a level of civility so that these threats sort of disappear.
That's great, and I really hope these efforts obviously pay off in the general election, and I think we've seen that they already have with some of the primaries. I think, kind of talking about you were discussing with the vote centers, we also know obviously that elections don't end on election day. There's post-election processes, certification, canvassing, all of those things. I think during the last election cycle, we saw some delays in counting ballots, which kind of lowered voter confidence because we're used to, generally election results being reported by the close of polls and then trickling in after. Can any of you discuss kind of how you think the best efforts that we can target at keeping voter confidence up during that post-election process, especially if there are any delays in election results?
So there's a couple of things we can do in that regard, and as I think, as we talk about our mayors and our mayor's set and the influence that they have and the ability to communicate to their constituents about what the elections process is, it really comes back to an educational piece. Here's what actually happens on election day. Here's what happens during early voting, and here's how ballots are cast. Here's how ballots are counted. And we've become such a society of instant gratification that somehow there's this idea that when the polling place closes at 7 p.m., if there's no one standing in line, we should have results by 9 p.m. Well, it really just doesn't work that way because the judges have to drive the equipment back and the voting results back to the central count location. We then take steps to ensure that we've received all the data that we're supposed to get back from those locations, and then we start reading. And for Harris County, we have 782 polling locations on election day. So if I'm reading one memory stick from each of those 782 locations and it takes me 1 minute per stick, that's 782 minutes. Now, I get to read 3 sticks at one time, but that's 3 into 782 per 1 minute. I'm still looking at 3 to 4, maybe 5 hours to tabulate votes. And that's just an educational process that I need, that the election administrator needs to communicate to our constituents. Here's the process. There's nothing nefarious here. There's just a time gap that takes place. So we have to be more transparent about what that looks like. So we're inviting the media in. We're invited our elected officials in so that they can speak confidently about the process and educate their constituents and educate their parties so that we kind of, again, dial down the temperature on why are we not seeing results within 2 hours of the polls closing.
Well, and I think the good news is that people are interested now. I mean, there's a much higher level of awareness from the truth side and the disinformation side, right? So our role is to make sure the truth gets out there, and obviously we're in a fight, it seems like, on what truth is these days. But communication, when communicated in advance, what you're going to do on what frequency builds trust. So think of it almost how we communicated during the pandemic. I mean, regular communication with our constituents. They knew when we were going to be talking, who we would bring to the table so they could expect a cadence of communication. Absent that, disinformation fills that void. And so we've got to say, here's what we're going to be doing, how often, here's our media partners, here's how you can answer questions, and then you show up. And what our experience was eventually is people say, okay, we got enough, you know, and then only the real hardcore ones stay with you all the way to the end. But you can build trust in the process by signaling what you're going to do in advance and do what you say you're going to do.
And that's a fantastic point by the mayor. Establishing the cadence, I mean, that's the right message. Here's when you're going to receive information. Here's what it's going to look like. And it's like a standard operating procedure. Here's what my process is. I followed my process. And if I don't follow the process, I have to explain why I deviated from the process. And again, it comes back to communication. And I like the idea of the cadence, the timing of what you're going to see, when you're going to see it. And look, you're seeing what we told you you're going to see.
And having people in advance that are trusted community messengers helps as well. You saw that again during the pandemic, that, you know, it could be an activist in a community, it could be a medical professional. It doesn't have to be just us. It could be somebody that the community looks at and says, I believe them. And then be very aggressive about fighting back against disinformation. You know, it seems like the disinformation folks are very aggressive and very strong, and sometimes there's a hesitancy to fight back against that for whatever reason, or be more mellow. But, you know, we're in a fight for our democracy right now. So, I mean, it's like, take the gloves off here, folks. You know, that doesn't mean you got to be angry or you got to be mad, but you got to be truthful and regular with what you're saying, and hopefully common sense will ultimately prevail.
I think on that point, some of the fights that we're seeing for our democracy are taking place now in the post-election process of things. Obviously, we're seeing suppression at the polls, but we're also seeing efforts to subvert elections after Election Day. You know, in 2020, we even saw efforts in Michigan to discard valid ballots from voters, especially in communities of color. We saw all these sham audits rise up in states like Pennsylvania, obviously in Arizona. And so I'd love to hear from all of you about what you think local leaders can do if we see efforts like that to subvert elections this November. How can they be voices in communities to underscore what's happening there, especially if it's, you know, an invalid process and you know, really nefarious efforts to undermine elections and subvert election results?
So I think the mayor said it right. The describing to the constituents, here's the process, and then demonstrating that we followed the process. Anyone can make an assertion that something was changed, but if we can show through a transparent manner that we followed our process and this is how the votes turned out, I'm not afraid of an audit. If I followed my processes, then the audit will demonstrate that I followed my processes and the results are what the results are. So from a policy perspective or from elected officials' perspectives who want to step into that process, I can't speak to that, but only to defend the processes that I followed, that I used and that I followed, and then show my work.
And I think, having a bipartisan team to do this is extraordinarily important, right? Michael Adams, who you mentioned, our Secretary of State, he said the problem with elections is not fraud, it's those claiming there's fraud. So it's just this noise out here. It's like the light that bugs are attracted to, and the media goes to it, and all of a sudden it becomes a thing. It's ridiculous. So having that bipartisan group to just say, this is fringe. It's not who we are. Here's the process. It's going to be audited. Here's how it took place. These are the facts. Protect our republic.
I just want to note really quickly that if we are all doing our jobs, if we are all achieving our goals, and we have a huge uptick in voter participation, it's going to take longer to count the votes, right? And for me personally, I would prefer for elections officials to spend hours, days getting an accurate count than trying to be fast. And so, when I think about November, let me be watching the TV for a week as I wait for the final count because so many people have voted. I also think that this gets into the importance of how local governments hire. To your point, Mayor, and having kind of trusted people deliver the message, if a local government does not look like the community it's serving, then those elections officials may not be trusted messengers, no matter how transparent they are. And so think about your cities, your towns as model employers, but that includes, diversity hiring strategies. I also think that this question fits into a kind of larger conversation. Again, thinking about combating hate, how many of your cities and towns have equal rights ordinances? Where the most marginalized among us know that your government is going to protect them, is going to stand up for them in elections and in other instances of civic life.
I think that's an extremely important point. I think it's also important to focus that some states have done this, but there are also important processes that can be implemented before election day to speed up the counting process. We see a lot of states start counting mail-in ballots as soon as they're arriving. If they do signature verification, they can also start that process early, and it makes it so much easier to quickly report election results. We obviously do want accuracy, but we want that accuracy obviously as soon as we can possibly do it too, and so we've seen a lot of states implement those processes to get an accurate count on election day. I'd also talk about election funding, because we know it's one of the things that can make the most impact for more security and accessibility. We've seen the federal government provide some funding, but obviously even in federal budgets and in local budgets, elections are chronically underfunded. I would love to hear from you all what you think we could do to better fund elections, and we know election officials are constantly making the most of every penny that they possibly get, but we'd love to hear from you on the aspects of funding and what you think the future of that will look like.
Funding directly impacts the level of services that the election administrator can offer to our constituents. If you think about what we spend our funds on, we spend monies on the actual polling locations that we use. We spend monies on the election workers that work the polling locations. We spend money on the educational materials that we use, that we send out. We spend money on the machines. So the point being is it costs money to conduct an election. And we've heard there's a couple of different philosophies. Democracy has no price. But at the end of the day, I can't get all the money that's in the county budget to conduct an election. So we have to scale back where we can to meet the budgets that we receive. We do look for funds to come from the federal government that then trickle down from the state to the county elections office itself. So funding is a real issue. I don't know that I have the answer to it. I think the mayor, as the mayor talks about the budget for his particular city and how that impacts the elections process, he likely has, and our elected officials has more input on the funding mechanisms than I do as the election administrator.
Yeah, there's a formula that, based on number of people where the funding takes place. But I think we need to reframe the issue. It's like, can we afford to have good, fair elections? Can we afford to protect our democracy? So think about the amount of money the United States has spent in Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine. Why are we spending money there? Well, ostensibly to build governments that allow people to have their voice be heard, to establish some form of democracy. Over $1 trillion. How much money are we spending in the United States of America to protect our democracy? It's a pittance compared to what we say is important other countries should be doing. So again, I think it's part of this reframing, waking up of America to say, what is going on in our country, and are we willing to invest in what we believe America is as a democracy? And again, these voices are too quiet in America as opposed to the other voices coming in with all the nonsense about fraud and all these other deniers. And obviously we see that proceeding extremely aggressively. Mayor Hancock was saying yesterday over 500 different issues on in different states' legislatures to restrict voting rights again. So I don't think we just need to be more creative and more radical relative to the defense of democracy and voting than what we are right now.
I think that's exactly right, and I think we've seen a shift, especially since Russian election interference in 2016, about us talking about election security as national security, and we know that the Department of Homeland Security has even designated it that. But I think to your point, I've been working on a report on election funding, and I think the most the federal government has given to elections in the last few years is $425 million, which sounds substantive, but it also isn't when we consider what we spend on other defense projects, like $13 billion for an air carrier or $300 million on military bands every year. There is no price tag for our democracy, but I think you made excellent points. I know we're kind of wrapping up our amazing discussion. I've had a great time with you all up here, and I think I would just love to have each of you give a few closing remarks on what you would like to everybody here to walk away with based on our discussion.
Well, first I'd like to wish Mayor Turner happy birthday today. He's a good young man. Thank Mayor Turner and Mayor Hancock for organizing this extraordinarily important event for our country. And we got good media coverage. I don't know if everybody noticed there was a nice spread in USA Today yesterday, including a shout out to Michael from Cities United, by the way, so way to go with that. My last comment would just be, democracy is a contact sport. And in your communities, is everybody involved? I say citizenship is three things. One, taking care of yourself so you can take care of your family. Second is take care of your employer or your employees. But third, do something for your city, state, or country for which you expect nothing in return, except you are a citizen of the United States of America. And voting fits into that. And too many people are kind of just tuning out about what the responsibilities are or of a citizen. And the fundamental responsibility is to vote. My wife is Greek, and her parents, if you live in Greece, you are required by law to vote. And they have about 86% voter turnout. They all go back to their villages to vote, but it's a national thing, of pride for the community. So let's just remember that. You can't disengage from democracy. You can't disengage from being a citizen. Democracy is a contact sport.
One of the things we are witnessing right now is states and counties and towns basically prescribing exactly how someone can vote, can cast their ballot. And in prescribing the way that someone has to vote, they're also telling you the kind of person you have to be in order to vote, right? America is one of the most diverse nations in the world. We need as many diverse methods of voting as possible. We need our methods of voting to be as diverse as our nation itself. And each one of those methods needs to be accessible, secure, and reliable.
Thank you for having me on the panel today. And what I always say to my team and to the folks that I talk with about voter education and the elections process is we have to step outside of our comfort zone and go beyond preaching to the choir to identifying those folks that aren't getting the message and determine why they aren't getting the message. And I use the phraseology, is it a skill? Is it an issue that they don't understand the message? Or is it a will they aren't interested in the message? And so then it becomes incumbent upon us to determine, to figure out how to make them interested in the message, interested in democracy, interested in the election process. Because at the end of the day, local politics has an impact on every individual's life in their particular community, in their particular city, in their particular state. And somehow they've become disconnected. They, meaning our citizens, have become disconnected from what their role should be in helping shape that, what that looks like. From an election administrator's perspective, education, communication, collaboration with our partners, and teamwork, and which means we're crossing the aisle from the R's and the D's and the other minor parties to working together to educate our constituents, to make the right decisions, whatever decision that may be, informed decisions on what the elections, what politics should look like in the country as a whole. Thank you.
Of course. And thank you all for this very thoughtful discussion this morning. I see that we brought the cowboy boots on this side of the panel. So thank you so much, everybody, for having us. And I hope we gave you a very enlightened discussion that'll have you keep in thinking about everything that was said here for the next few days to come. Thank you.
We thank our panelists, Cliff Tate, Elections Administrator, Harris County, Mayor Greg Fisher, City of Louisville, Kentucky, Maria Town, President and CEO, American Association of People with Disabilities, and our moderator, Greta Betakovich, Associate Director of Democracy, Center for American Progress. Now please welcome to the stage Mayors Michael Hancock of Denver, Aquanetta Warren of Fontana, California, Mayor Sylvester Turner of Houston, and Mr. Clarence Anthony, Executive Director of the National League of Cities.
Every time I come on the stage and the organ is playing, I don't know why I want to turn into a preacher. I'm waiting on my calling, y'all. Y'all call up.
If the Spirit
you
already got the calling. Preach it, brother, preach it.
Yeah,
gonna do it. Amen. Well.
Yeah, don't start. Oh, Lord, don't start. Don't start. Good morning, y'all.
Good morning. Oh, they got to wake up.
What a wonderful few days that we have had together. You know how when you start a process and you have a vision of what the end would look like? I mean, we achieved that in my vision. It gave an opportunity for us to lift up an issue that is clearly in the front of everybody's mind every day. And that is, will my vote count? Will I have access to opportunities to vote? Can I overcome those barriers that perhaps are being created to stop me from voting? And from what I saw and the participation of all of those in the breakout groups, we went head on in talking about the tough issues related to voting. So mayors, let me first say congratulations to you for hosting us. Congratulations to you for this second convening. And a big thanks to all of you for giving us some of your brain power and time. I think Maria said it best at the end, and it was very touching to hear that this is our goal here, to get everybody to be able to vote, and the diversity in America and the inclusivity that we need to have in mind. I don't know what you think, you guys think. Let me start with you, Mayor Hancock.
You know, this is, it was amazing to watch what the Houston team has put together, to see all of your engagement at a very high level, to hear the experts to step up here and to speak, to be moved by the Speaker of the House out of Arizona and his powerful presentation. It was just heartwarming, and I tell you that there were moments when I would walk in and out of the rooms and see everyone engaged and see Fontana, Mayor Aquanetta Warren walk on stage. And it was I would have moments of, I don't know what you say, when you kind of realize that what we have come together to do was being realized. And that's a powerful moment. But then it hit me and said, okay, so what's next in this movement? And I think that for me, the next opportunity is where those folks who are in those legislatures come to the stage and explain to us what they're thinking in proposing suppressive laws. And I think that's our next opportunity, to get them in the room and to face the people who are saying, what are you trying to do to our legacy of voter rights?
Mayor Turner?
I will tell you, number one, let me thank Mayor Hancock again for allowing us to host the people in the city of Houston. So thank you, and let me thank you for starting this initiative. Because over the last few days, I think it has helped to rejuvenate all of us. I mean, for those of us who are serving in elective office or in various organizations, we do this every day. And then, but many times, you know, we just need to be rejuvenated and be reminded of the work that we need to do. And the last few days has served as a reminder to listen to the speakers and their insight from different perspectives, to talk about access and inclusiveness. And again, this morning, the video on Otis Moss kind of helped to bring all of those things together to serve as a reminder that we are talking about the right to vote. But there are many people back then who didn't have the right to vote, and there are many people right now who are being restricted in their right to vote. But Otis Moss kept walking, and he kept walking, and he kept walking. And now we need to keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting.
All right. Mayor Warren, we're reflecting on the last 3 days, and I talked about that vision we had and how we achieved it. What are your thoughts about the last few days?
You know, I was just walking down the hallway, and I just thinking about my community and where I grew up. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles, and everything that is about me was in me as a result of that growth there. We didn't even know we were so-called the ghetto. We thought we were the richest children in the world. My father worked, my mother stayed at home with us. We always ate together. We never got to play out in the front yard because it was dangerous. So our parents had a big enough backyard that it was like our park and my mother's garden. And as I was walking down the hallway reflecting on that video, That's all of us in this room. Every time you walk and get out of your car and you go to the poll, you should think about the people, regardless of their nationality, their gender. You should think about the people who made that happen for you. You know, something we need to go back to is grassroots. I was thinking just now, I'm going to advertise for precinct captains. Remember, we had precinct captains, and they were responsible for that precinct, and they worked that precinct for their candidate. But more importantly, there was a one-on-one dialogue between someone that lived next door to you, that went to church with you, that may have worked with you, that knew you, that made you feel obligated to vote. The worst thing that I find when I'm walking door to door is when I'm on one door on that street. We can no longer ignore those streets that don't have people voting. We need to go back and cultivate that relationship. There shouldn't be one yard sign on that street. There should be several on that street. So the challenge I think we have as leaders is that it has to come from us. You know, they always tell us, if you lead appropriately, people will follow your direction. It's very difficult because you may be recruiting people that will not vote for you. But that's not why God put us in these positions. He put us in these positions so that we too can grow. I don't do anything during an election more concentrated than work on the undecideds and the no's. And those are the people that typically will not vote. So challenge yourself to do better in your outreach. And that's how we make these problems go away. There's more of us than them. Let's act like it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So the audience already know I don't stay on script. So y'all ready?
Yeah.
Mayor Turner, I'm going to start with you. What was your why for running for office? I ain't got all day. I'm just saying.
No. Mine, I can quickly tell you my why. I had a older brother who needed mental behavioral health services. And my mom would take him on the bus, 2 buses, to the Harris County Hospital, and I rode along with her. And when we got to the hospital, the doctor said, until he becomes a danger to himself or somebody else, we're going to give you this medication. And said goodbye. And we would get back on those 2 buses, and I would get on that bus, and my mom would be saying, this is messed up. And I said to myself, it is hell to be poor. And that if I ever had an opportunity to address these mental health issues, that is what I was in high school. And so when I came back from law school, and there was a position on the Harris County Commissioner's Court that was open, and I found out that it had something to do with mental health services, I ran for office. I did not win, I lost, but I ran for that reason. And then 5 years later, when there was a position in the state legislature came open, and again, I found out they had something to do with funding for mental health services. I ran and I won. That's what got me in office.
Wow. Mayor Warren, what was your why that you would ask people to vote for you? What encouraged you? What was the why?
You know, I keep talking about my parents because they're my guiding light, even though they're no longer here with me. But we were raised watching the television every night, Walter Cronkite talking about the civil rights. And I had in my mind, if I watched that long enough, I might see my grandmother, because she spoke very clearly of her intent to help African Americans be liberated. And that morning, when my mother came and woke us up and got us ready for church, and we were waiting to leave, and it came across the radio that they had just bombed that church and killed 4 little black girls. something came over me that I will never be able to describe. At first I thought it was fear, but the more I thought about it, maybe a couple of months later, because it took my mother and dad all day to get on the phone and find my aunt. She used to play piano at the different churches, and they just figured she might have been at that church and they couldn't get in touch with her. But finally my grandmother called and said she was okay. She went to another church that Sunday. But one day my dad was sitting on the porch and he watched me and he said, "What's going on with you, girl?" I said, "Daddy, I'm so afraid of white people. I'm afraid they're gonna kill my sisters and brothers." And he smiled at me. He said, "You know what? You're not supposed to be afraid. You're supposed to help. You're supposed to change things." And my dad made a point of making sure every one of us joined the law enforcement explorers in our area. He did not want us to be afraid of police, and he did not want us to be afraid of white people. He told us and he taught us that we have to love everyone. And I was one of the first African Americans for LA Unified School District that got bused to integrate schools. I was on that bus almost by myself with 2 other students. Got off that bus and they put us in one classroom. 2 days later, the superintendent came up and said, "That's not the purpose of this program. It's to be integrating the classrooms. And by the way, Aquanetta plays the piano and the violin, and her mother wants her in the orchestra." And so that changed so much of my perception after coming from an all-black elementary school. But what happened, it was in San Pedro, California, where it was Camp Pendleton. I had the honor of being around every nationality in the world because all the soldiers lived there. And I learned to love everybody, the kids from Australia, the kids from England, the kids from Mississippi, everybody. We just loved each other. And as I grew, I worked hard in the community. And I decided I'm not going to sit on my butt and wait for something to happen. I'm going to make it happen. And I can never forget the look on my dad and my mom's face when I was appointed in my council as the first African American in Fontana on that council. They both got to see that, and my mother, God bless her, got to see me become mayor. If you can't do it for you, do it for the others that are watching you. Just remember that. If you won't do for you, do for the ones that are watching you. And I love at Halloween how many schools I go to, and the young people dress up like me. And it just cracks me up when them little girls come up to me. I got my St. John coat on, Mayor, and my hair is all over the place.
Thank you, Mayor. Oh, that's great. Mayor Hancock.
Real simply, I just have a pet peeve of folks who complain but never really raise their hand and say, "I'll do it," or "I'll engage." And so what motivated me is I just believe in my heart, be the change that you desire to see and to be the one who'll go. I admire leaders, whether I agree with them or not. I admire people who avail themselves to be the one, to show up. And that just comes from one of my favorite stories in the Bible where there's chaos in the land, and the Lord asked Isaiah, "Who will go for us? Who shall I send?" And we know the rest of the story. Isaiah raised his hand, said, "Send me." And to me, that's the power of a true leader. Again, whether we agree with them or not, when there's something that needs to be addressed, it's easy to sit, complain, and say, "Look at that." But the one who raises their hand and said, "Here am I, ready, willing, and prepared. Send me." And that to me is the power of leadership, and why when I was 33 years old, decided to run for city council.
Wow. You know, I think I reflect on my decision when I ran for office. Went off to college, and even growing up, I grew up in a rural community, celery fields, cane fields, and I really never saw black elected officials. And I look at the impact of public policy when I was in college. If it wasn't for the housing and urban development programs, I wouldn't have had a house in the project. Now, it was a house, y'all, so it was still the policies. If it wasn't for the Civil Rights Act, I would not have had the opportunity to vote. I mean, I can go on and on. The food programs that we are able to get, the powdered milk and the cheese that I had to stand in line to get as a kid. So when I came back home, I went to a city commission meeting, and because we had crime had just increased significantly. And the mayor said at that time, Mr. Anthony, you've been away to college. We got a lot of other things to deal with. I was like, oh, okay. I'm gonna show you what you're gonna deal with the next election. And that was the way in which I ran for office, because I wanted to improve my community. So at 23, I declared. At 24, I got elected. And I share that story with the young folks because I think historically there was this concept that we had to wait our turn. You know, especially when it looked, you know, Congress, I ain't saying y'all should run against any of your congressional people, but there are people who've been 30 years, and they're asking us to wait our turn. I really know that that is not the way in which policy is developed and working now. And I hope the audience will think about their why and when you're going to step up. What's going to stimulate you to get this handbook and take action? What's your call to action one day that you're going to say enough is enough, that we need to all go out there and find somebody that can help us with this vision that we have here? So the breakout groups. There were some significant things that came out of the breakout groups, y'all, and I want to let you know that. And we want to continue to, my staff don't know this yet, but we want to continue to update this toolkit, this playbook, so that it continues to be relevant. I think that as I read the notes and walked around, there was some duplication in terms of recommendations from last year. But I do think there were some small things that hit me. Opening up the elections office and giving tours of the elections office. Isn't that just simple?
Yep.
Because I think that a lot of folks think that their elections office is not open. It's like having open houses at HBCUs or a university. You can have I've seen it communities where a school is right across the street, but people don't think that school is open to them.
Right.
So I think one of the compelling ideas that I got was that idea. The second one, and I really think Maria hit it on the head, America is the most diverse nation in the world, and we have to come up with diverse strategies. The last report in the playbook did not focus on inclusivity, disabilities. It didn't focus on LGBTQ+, the trans issue, where the driver's license looks one way, and then as we move and transition, that driver's license could be a challenge. How do we approach that issue? Social media scares the hell out of me, but I think we got to open up to it and figure out how we can get the truth out in a way that it's accurate and inclusive again. The session with the young folks was young adults. I'm sorry. I be talking to my daughter like that. You young folks. I'm at home. I know I'm feeling really comfortable. So it really is something that we haven't cracked yet, Mayor Turner. I just think we gotta dig, and the next time we do this, it's almost as if we need to set aside some time for all of us to engage on that and not put it on just the young adults to be able to come up with this idea. Because there's something missing there in regards to their, right now, commitment to owning the responsibility to vote. We're not doing something right, and we gotta dig into that. And I wish I had the answer, but just listening to them during the breakout group, we haven't found the it yet that makes you jump up and wanna be excited. The other thing I think is the word commitment that I kept hearing and seeing when I was walking around to some of the breakout groups. Again, there's that it that is missing to define why are we committed. Your story is why you're committed. I don't know if we become too complacent in some ways, that things are coming, that the elections are not impacting my life enough yet. I'm not sure. But we got to figure that out because the baton is being dropped. Mayor Warren?
You know, I can't help but comment on that. During our breakout session, it was really clear. People think the only election that counts is the presidential election. We've got to change that tone so they understand locally you've got to be involved because that's what impacts you most. We'll take care of the federal level. That's why we run to D.C. and holler at the president every chance we get. But the local level is what impacts people the most. And that's something that changed. And also competition. None of you asked me why I'm a Republican. And I grew up in a Democratic family, in a Democratic area. I found that we were all African Americans, we were all Democrats. And at that time I was living in Compton. And I saw no change in anything. I got tired of going on calls to companies in Orange County and beautiful parks, kids playing outside, beautiful manicured yards, street lights that actually worked. And I decided in my mind I needed to devise competition to get people to get things done. Quit ignoring people that are not of you. Or, you know, like sometimes when I walk in the room, I see people whispering. I know what they're saying. She's Republican. So what? I'm an American. So we have to include all. This was a great conference. You had Republicans, you had independents, you had Democrats. That's the way we should be behaving because we are alienating each other too much. And that's why these young people are saying, why would I want to be a part of that process? They don't even like each other.
Well, let's, I want to have Mayor Turner to close us out, but there's a call to action and a responsibility by attending this convening. The call to action to each of us to recognize that this is not just an event, it's a long-term commitment to educating, creating access, and making sure that barriers are broken down in our system. And don't get frustrated, because if we do, we won't accomplish our goal in terms of making sure that everybody remembers that the foundation of American democracy and the greatest right and the most power we have, it's amazing, no matter whether you're wealthy, poor, or wherever you live, that ability to vote is so powerful. Because we always say one vote counts. We've seen more elections lately that people are tossing nickels to be able to see heads or tail whether or not who wins an election. That's the power we have. And I will tell you, I'm more energized, mayors, more excited about us moving forward with this work. It's not over. We're going to make sure that mayors, council members, local officials all over America, cities, towns, and villages, get this information to see what their role is, because there is a role. I do think Mayor Warren is really correct. We tend to think about those federal positions a lot, but those school board positions, city council, mayor's positions, park district, Mayor Woodard's, her first election was a park district person in Tacoma, Washington. And I guess it wasn't big enough for her, so she said, I want to be mayor. But that's her start, and that was her story. So finally, thank you all for giving us the honor to be here in Houston these last few days, to share, to become family and friends, to understand that we all have the responsibility to make sure that everybody has this ability to vote. Hey, God bless y'all, and appreciate all of you for allowing us to be here. Thank you all. Thank you. Mayor Turner.
Thank you. And look, let me acknowledge again Mayor Hancock. He started this, and Mayor Hancock's term will end in April of next year, July of next year. So join me in thanking Mayor Michael Hancock for his vision and his leadership. And look, even though his term ends in July, we don't want to lose his knowledge and his expertise and his counsel, so we want to keep that going. Mayor Fisher's term will end at the end of this year. Please join me in acknowledging Mayor Greg Fisher. And he's another one who has served his city and the country through the U.S. Conference of Mayors extremely well, and we don't want to lose his leadership and his experience. We have to find a way to harness these individuals and keep them very much connected with us. Give it up to Clarence Anthony, the head of the National League of Cities. Thank you. And give it up to all 6 of these mayors, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, that made it happen. And for me, and that was most powerful, to see 6 mayors, even though Mayor from Tucson, Romero was not with us. Her video was very, very potent, very powerful. But to see 6 mayors, 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans coming together on voting was just incredible, and singing the same song. Okay, so that was just very powerful. I want to give it up to the planning committee as a whole, because we had representatives from each one of these co-host mayors' staff that worked very hard over the last several months. Even while the mayors were doing other things, the staff was being very, very attentive, and oftentimes we overlooked the staff. So I want to thank the planning committee, the staff of each one of the mayors who contributed, who made this event possible, who stayed in touch. Thank you so very, very much. And then, yeah, please give it up to the staff. And then I want to thank all of the participants on every one of the panels, whatever role you played, from the audio, video people to the panelists, to those who led out on the breakout sessions. But most importantly, I want to thank each and every one of you for giving up your time and being with us throughout, from Monday, from the reception, all day Tuesday to today. Let me thank each and every one of you for participating and making it happen. It's been an enjoyable event for those who are flying out and going back to your respective cities. You know, Godspeed, safe travel, and then look forward to meeting again. For those who are staying around, and for those who are from Houston, and this, I'm segueing away from the National Nonpartisan Voter Conference. You know, that was said there. Now let me get on my, being the mayor of the city of Houston. Okay, this is me being the mayor of the city of Houston. Now y'all know my party is tonight at at Southwest Grill, where many of them ate last night, the restaurant tonight as a whole is mine. And so the whole restaurant is mine tonight, celebrating my 19th birthday.
Speaking of which, help us out.
You getting ready to sing?
Birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.
The National Nonpartisan Conversation on Voters' Rights thanks you for your time, attention, and input this week. For your convenience, a grab-and-go lunch is made available outside the doors of this conference room. The National Nonpartisan Conversation on Voter Rights stands adjourned, but let's keep the conversation going.